welcome everybody to this latest installment of the Thursday virtual show. My name is Simon Ingold. I recently joined the YA Board of Governors, and I'm hosting this particular channel, the Omnibus channel, alongside my colleague Stephanie Grilli, who you all know, of course. And just a quick disclaimer from my end, it's 2 a.m. in Zurich, where I am at the moment, and I'm moving house today. So, forgive me if I'm not in full control of all my senses at all times for the session, but let's see how it goes. The format is as usual. So we start off with a 30-minute interview with our guest of tonight, and then continue with Q&A. You can post your questions in the chat, and we will then call on you to ask the question directly. The topic of tonight is pioneering sustainable finance and international development, and I'm extremely thrilled to welcome Aniket Shah as our guest tonight, not only because he's an extraordinary person, but also because he's a very close friend of mine. And I want to start off with a quick anecdote about how we two met. I believe it was in 2007, and we met at I think it was LaGuardia Airport, boarding a plane to Casablanca in Morocco to actually attend a election monitoring mission in the Western African country of Mauritania, which at the time held its first democratic elections ever. So we were both part of that delegation, and were roommates at the time. And that's how I got to know Aniket. I was extremely impressed with him. I'm sure you've read his short bio. He published his first book when he was still a teenager. Then he attended Yale. At the time, he joined the board of Amnesty International as the youngest board member ever, certainly. After Yale, I joined Goldman for a while, then went back to academia to work with Jeff Sachs at Columbia, and then went back into the private sector, where he still is. He is now the global head of ESG research at Jefferies. And again, very, very pleased to have him with us. And I want to start off by asking Aniket, what got you first interested in the developing world, actually?
Simon, thank you so much for that warm introduction, and I'll just respond with a anecdote for everyone to know, which is that what kind of person Simon Ingold is. Which is that several years ago, maybe 10 plus years ago, I'll still never forget it. I was visiting Geneva for work, and I told Simon that I was visiting, and he drove from Zurich to Geneva to have lunch, and we had this beautiful lunch outside looking over the water. And I'll never forget, I said, I'm what a blessing it is. I have a friend who would drive 5, 6, 7 hours to have lunch with me. Of all people, and it just shows just what not just reliable, but what a deep friend Simon is, and how he's probably the most sort of steadfast person that I know. I know if I ever needed Simon, even at 2 a.m. in Zurich, this man would pick up the phone, and that's, I think, it's a great blessing. So. As Simon mentioned, I've sort of spent my life crisscrossing the public and the private worlds, trying to piece together economics and finance on the one side and the sustainable development needs of the world on the other. And although I would say that the journey started maybe in March of 2007 when we were in Mauritania, I think the journey really started many years before that, because I was born to an Indian family in the US and spent many a summer in India, seeing just a completely different life than the one we were living in suburban New Jersey. I then spent 3 years in my childhood, age 12 to 15, living in New Delhi, in what was a very interesting moment, because it was late 90s and early 2000s, and India was just sort of starting to really develop and grow. And you notice just an incredible amount of opportunity and an incredible amount of poverty coexisting at the same time. And when you see that when you're young, and you ask yourself, how can this exist? To be honest, it just stays with you. It just becomes an all-encompassing question. So sort of the coexistence of huge needs in the world with huge wealth and huge capacity is something that still to this day drives my work and my thinking. And I think it started just from, to answer your question, from a childhood spent living and traveling through India and having to confront many of these things from a young age.
Yeah, that's I think that makes a lot of sense to have these early sort of impressions that kind of last a lifetime. More specifically, how did you approach your sort of initial career decisions in relation to these particular experiences?
Yeah, so look, Yale played a big role in this. So when I was a freshman at Yale, I was amazed to know that the former president of Mexico was a professor there running the Center for the Study of Globalization. I just couldn't believe it that you had a former president just sitting there at Bet's house. And so I wrote him an email one day, not thinking he would respond. And he wrote back immediately and said, come to my office. And I went and met Ernesto Zedillo, and he invited me to be his research assistant for 4 years when I was an undergrad at Yale. So from age 17 to 21, I was basically doing my coursework and then nights and weekends working with him and his team on various projects that he was involved in. And Dr. Zedillo is a remarkable human being, also one of the kindest people you'll ever meet, so down to earth. And he very much encouraged my interest, which is, I said, I'm interested in issues of development and globalization and so on. And he and Yale really supported me, and every summer was spent on a different continent, and every spring break was spent monitoring an election in Africa or monitoring an election in Mauritania or in Kenya or in Rwanda, this and that. And then when I graduated in 2009, the world had collapsed, of course, in 2008. And I had tried to get a job to pursue my interest in economic development and human rights. And as Simon mentioned, I was on the board of directors of Amnesty International starting age 18. So I was involved in that world. But I couldn't get a job I couldn't get a single job aside from being an investment banking analyst at Goldman Sachs, which, if you work in the world of finance, is one of these sort of highly revered, first jobs out of school and a ticket to millions and more. And within a few weeks of me being there, I realized this was just not for me. And so one day I wrote a blind email to Professor Jeffrey Sachs at the Earth Institute at Columbia University, asking him if I could meet him and seek his advice of someone who had read all of his work and wanted to live a life of thinking about these issues and trying to influence, development and influence, have a positive influence on poverty. And the guy wrote back and he said, come to my office. And long story short, he said, I can offer you a job making $42,000 a year as my research assistant, which, let's just say, was a fraction of what I was making at Goldman at 21 and what I would have made. And so I called up my parents and I called up, my mom and dad. I said, Mom and Dad, I'm leaving Goldman to go work for this professor at Columbia, sort of 5 months into my job there. And that was the best decision of my life. And, starting in November of 2009, I got to explore this topic of economics and sustainable development. And 12 years later, this is now the topic of the world, especially as we're going into COP26. There's nothing, I would argue, even remotely close in importance than figuring this out. And it's an unbelievably complicated set of issues. The politics are complicated, the economics are complicated, the financing is complicated, the history of it is complicated. So in many ways, working on sustainable development requires one to use all the facilities that you learn at Yale and your life since to sort of piece it together. And I've been very lucky to have spent my life so far working on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear to me that, you know, you've put so much thought into these issues over the past, you know, decade or so, that you have certainly have a head start, you know, versus the competition, because as you rightly point out, 12 years ago, nobody would have considered to work for, you know, an impact investor or for, you know, any sort of sustainable finance company. Everybody was aiming for the Goldman jobs, and now all of a sudden, you know, Goldman is trying to wrestle their way into this field as well. So, I mean, you know, what's happened is happened at a breakneck, you know, pace over the past 12 years, and I'm just curious to understand, you know, how or why do you think that is? I mean, obviously, talk a lot about, you know, climate change, et cetera, but that aside, what triggered this enormous interest in this field that's, you know, at least I get the feeling that almost makes it a little bit, you know, buzzy at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I'm sure we have a numerate crowd here, let me just lay out some numbers of what we're facing. You know, the topic of sustainable development is really trying to solve the following riddle, or this following puzzle, which is we have 7.8 billion people in the world, growing to 10 billion, 11 billion people by the end of the century. We have roughly $100 trillion economy that's growing at 3% a year. Even, by the way, through a financial crisis or through a pandemic which shuts down most of the world, we still have close to $100 trillion of economic output. And all of this, we have around 51 billion tons of CO2 and their equivalents that needs to get to zero, basically in around 20 years. And without that, we enter into a period of planetary instability that you can only dream about or read in science fiction novels. Now, that basic math was well understood by the climate science world for a long time, but basically every other field was slow to it. You know, the economics profession as a whole basically ignored the topic of climate until very recently. And even now, in most formal economic growth models and trade models and so on, we don't even think about the whole nature and environmental side. It's not part of the thinking. The business world has been operating without any thought of externalities at all, right? I mean, we have all of this carbon that we're pumping out, and by the way, that's just on the environmental side. Or on the climate mitigation side, then there's the biodiversity issue. There's the fact that business has systematically underpaid, you know, workers and this and that all across the country and the world. And that has put externalities as a cost to society, which now people are saying, okay, now business has to start internalizing more. So you had, and then politics also, by the way, just had no formal consideration, at least in the US and in India and in China, and I would say in large parts of Europe, even though more cognizant of climate, wasn't really making the big drastic changes that are needed. And the last 15 years, I think, has just been a moment or a series of moments of greater awareness, because we're seeing the impacts of all of this around us. You know, we are living in a moment of just unbelievable instability, and that's at 1.2 degrees Celsius of climate change. We're on a 3+ degree path. So I think people sort of caught on to it. I think there were many sort of micro reasons, but this is just so glaring, you know, in our face now. You can't ignore it. And then, for all of its faults, humanity does what it does best, which is people got smart. They started thinking, they started assembling, they started reading, they started researching, the university spent more time, and so on and so forth. And here we are now, which is we finally have a fight on our hands. We have a fight between the incredible inertia of the system. And by the way, I mean, it is amazing how inert political systems are and financial systems are and economic systems. There's a lot of inertia. And at the same time, there's this unbelievable interest in trying to change things. And there's a lot of desire right now to criticize this ESG movement in finance, or the impact investing or sustainable finance and all this as greenwashing. And surely there are elements of that, a lot of it, by the way. But it's also, we're trying to do something that has never been done before. We're trying to change the inputs and the outputs of how we think about how our economy should be run. And that's really hard. And I'm in those fights in the trenches every single day. And so what's happened is that a lot of smart people are now participating in this, which is good. I think the positive thing now, and I'll end here and hand it back to you, Simon, is that thanks to maybe 20 years of a lot of focus from a lot of smart people, we now understand the basic contours of the problem. I don't think we have the solution yet, but I think more and more people realize what the challenge is ahead of us. And I think the first part of solving any problem is knowing that you have one. And I think we've probably achieved that in the last little bit.
Jeff, you raised your hand.
I did. If you ask a question, it's always nice to kind of interject and hear what you're saying. Aniket, it's been a great discussion. I've got some footing in this area. I've been involved with a fund called Earth Capital for a little bit, and so obviously it's in the name what we're trying to do, both in terms of growth capital and venture and so forth. But I'll tell you, on a personal level, I think of this, and it's an immense problem. Where every day we hear more and more about it. But in the 18th, 19th centuries, economics was really political economy, right? The interest of governments and so forth. And I just can't avoid thinking what really is going to happen when you kind of sit back and realize that Siberia is going to end up being the best farmland on the planet. And so what's the interest going to be there to fight these kind of issues when areas like that, on the positive side, most of the Yukon in Canada will be farmland. Right? What do you do with that when the interest for those parties is really to let it happen? So you're getting some maybe some lip service now, but in the end, it's such an economic driver for some of these bad situations. Will be good for certain countries, and it's going to be hard to fight.
I think, yes, there are certainly some winners from a world that is warming, to be sure. But I don't think that the intransigence is not because those countries are looking forward to what positive will come of this. It is that countries don't want to lose an enormous asset that they have on their balance sheet, which is oil, gas, and coal, because there's literally hundreds of trillions of dollars there in unexplored fossil fuels that serve as the basis of many countries' economies, US being one of them, by the way. That is really what's holding this back. So there's certainly a political issue. Again, the only slight deviation I have from you is it's not from the positives of a world that is warming, but it is to prevent the losses of a world that takes climate more seriously. But I think the second issue, and this is just, I think, something we have to confront, is that fossil fuels, which, by the way, even today still power 82% of the world's primary energy today, still comes from fossil fuels. So despite all, and by the way, that number was 85% just 20 years ago. So but the amount of energy has gone up so significantly, so which is why emissions are increasing, not decreasing. But one of the major challenges we have is that fossil fuels are actually just a very efficient form of energy, and we have built up an entire global economy on the back of fossil fuels. We have 1 billion plus internal combustion engine cars. We have God knows how many coal-fired power plants that are powering factories and powering industry. Now, yes, we are at the point now where more and more of renewables plus batteries, by the way, are cost competitive with fossil fuels. And by the way, we talk about the subsidies to renewables, we ignore the subsidies to fossil fuels. So the economics are on our side for renewables. The challenge, though, is that it is just very hard to change basically the heart of an economy in real life, in real time, globally, right? I mean, that's just a very, very hard engineering problem, very hard financial problem, and so on. There's another major challenge, which is significant, which is that the historical contribution of some countries versus others, right? So if you go to India or if you go to Africa, they'll say, hey, we will only go to renewables or a low carbon approach if it makes sense in our economic interest, because we've contributed basically nothing to the issues of climate change. I mean, just to give you a number, the per capita emissions in the US is around 18 tons per person per year. That number in India is 2 tons. That number in Ethiopia is 0.8 tons. So you have this enormous discrepancy. And then sadly, it's just a fate of geography that Africa and South Asia are going to be hit the hardest geographically from a problem that they didn't themselves create. So it is a mind-bendingly set of, a set of challenges which we're all confronting again and again, especially in the lead up to COP26. And your point, Jeff, is absolutely right, that economic interests of countries is really the main reason why we haven't had as much progress as we need. I think that the economics have changed, and I think the technology has changed. But I don't want to minimize the difficulty, which is why, to Simon's earlier point about this becoming buzzy, I get very frustrated with the people who are just signing up to pledges and signing up to this and that without actually being honest and clear, saying that this is the hardest thing humanity will ever do, which is trying to change the way we operate in 2 generations with 8 billion people on this planet. But that's the project that we have in front of us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So and Aniket, we had a couple of pre-submitted questions, and one of them actually plugs into what you're just talking about. I don't think Connor is actually here tonight, but this is a question from Connor Lockenbrook. Have you seen anything that gets you excited with regards to startups trying to tackle ESG measurement and management? And to that point, do you think there are technological advances necessary, or is it more a question of applying the right frameworks?
That's a good question. So look, I mean, there is an entire cottage industry that has been built around measurement of ESG issues. You can measure, for example, CO2 emissions down to as specific asset level if you're a company. There's measurement stuff for publicly listed companies. There's a lot of measurement work that is happening. I'm generally of the view that this is not a measurement problem. This is a mindset problem. It's not a measurement problem. We can measure and report and disclose, and companies are all disclosing on all these ESG metrics now. But we have an economic system right now that is still not really aligned with what we need for sustainable development. Very simply put, we don't price most externalities, right? So you emit a ton of carbon right now here in this country, you just, poop, it comes out of your factory. You're not paying for that. There's no cost to you, even though there is a cost to you, because there is a cost to society, because that 1 ton of carbon has damages to the world. And we know this through the work of Bill Nordhaus and the social cost of carbon and so on, but we don't actually put that cost on anybody. The weighted average cost of carbon today is $3 per ton of CO2, whereas we know from the IPCC that number has to be 2 orders of magnitude higher. That's not a measurement problem, right? It's not that we don't have the measurements of this, is we don't have a mindset around this. We don't have a economic system where people say, yeah, I got to pay for that. I got to pay for that ton of CO2. outside of climate, you think about it on the social side. You go and buy a tea. My grandfather used to say this, he said, I never met him, but he said this. He was maybe a sustainable development thinker before it was fashionable. He would say, you go to you go to a store and you buy a t-shirt and it costs $5. You ever ask yourself, why is it only $5? Maybe it's because we are paying the Bangladeshi worker, much less than a humane wage. Maybe because when the t-shirt is shipped over from Bangladesh to New York, the airplane doesn't have to pay for, or the airline company doesn't have to pay for the CO2 emissions. Like, we just don't think about this. It's not the way that our system is set up right now. And so, so there, I've seen over the last 10 years in this world, an enormous outpouring of measurements and metrics and this and that. But I can tell you, and Simon, I'm sure would agree with this, that from his days as an investment banker, when you sit down with a portfolio manager who's actually investing in money, they're not going through the page 80 of the sustainability report looking at the scope 3 emissions and this. That's not the way that people invest money. I mean, let's just be serious. Government has to set the rules of the game. And then we all, as economic actors, operate within those rules. The challenge is that, in my humble opinion, is that the rules of the game today are not set in a way to solve this problem. It's changing a little bit, and it's in some regions much more than others. And then on the thing about technology and so on, there are two frames of thought here, right? One is that if you look at the IEA's net zero scenario, which was a really profound piece of work that the International Energy Agency put out this summer, they say that we have all of the technology we need for decarbonization up to 2030, but that the decarbonization needs for the second half of this effort from 2030 on, we only have 50% of the technology. So that there needs to be major technological improvements in a whole slew of spaces. That's what the IEA says. Other scientists have said no. So, for example, the Princeton team that put together the Net Zero America, by the way, this is all online for free. You can read the Princeton Net Zero America initiative. They came out and said that the US economy has all the technologies that we need to get to net zero by 2050 today. It's just a matter of taking those technologies and expanding their use. So the question of whether and the answer is probably a little bit of both, that you need more investment in R&D in major areas of this whole ecosystem. I sort of come down on that path. But I think the people that you need to fund that research is actually government. It's not the private sector. The private sector is not good at doing fundamental R&D investment. That you need basically people who are willing to lose a lot of money to go and explore a bunch of different things, which is generally government.
So we have a couple of questions in chat, but I'm going to break with sequence, because if that's okay with you, Nancy, because Alexandra has a question that kind of follows from what Aniket is talking about right now. So Aniket, Alexandra, do you want to ask your question?
Hi, yes. I'm currently sitting in a college dorm room, so I will not show you guys the state of my room at the moment. So I'm going to leave my camera off. But I have a question. It's a bit more ideological, but you've talked about assigning economic costs to a lot of these damages, and kind of assigning a specific actor to pay those costs, which obviously still falls within a very capitalist framework of assessing these kind of social and climate issues. So my question is, do you think that capitalism and the obvious power of capitalism can be harnessed in order to address these issues? Or do you think there has to be a break from that framework in order to properly and most effectively provide solutions that are sustainable?
It's a brilliant question, Alexandra. You must be reading a lot in your dorm room, because you're asking I think the most interesting question out there. And I write about this. I wrote a piece recently at my job about degrowth as a concept, which people might find insane, that an investment bank has a head of sustainability research who's talking about degrowth. But I tell you, when I wrote about it, I had CIOs, chief investment officers from some of the biggest pools of capital in the world saying, Aniket, I completely agree with you. So let me just frame it a little bit because your question is a very good one. The question is basically, is there an inextricable linkage between economic growth on the one hand? I'm going to expand your question from capitalism to growth, because capitalism is sort of about market-oriented systems. And the reality is that we now operate in basically a fully market-oriented global economy. And the work of Branko Milanovic on this topic is really, you should read his book, Capitalism Alone, which is really about how we have one economic paradigm with certain flavors in different parts of the world. But capitalism is just about private ownership of the means of production. And so, I would just sort of take a cousin to capitalism, which is, they're linked, of course, especially if you read Marx, right? That capitalist systems need growth to sort of continue. And so let's talk about growth. So can we have a global economy that continues to have growth as its end goal and live within these planetary boundaries? Here's the positive and the negative. The positive of that argument is the following. Number one, that if you set the right rules of the game, that the market is the most efficient way, or the market dynamics, the most efficient way of allocating scarce resources, because you have hundreds of billions of transactions happening all the time with sellers and buyers, and it's the distributed intelligence of all those market participants who set the price of a good, and the setting of the price of good between buyers and sellers is what allows for efficient allocation. And of course, if you ever have the time, you should Google Milton Friedman pencil. And Milton Friedman has he did this wonderful thing where he pulls out a pencil and he says, this pencil is not created because one person wanted to create a pencil or because one person knows how to create a pencil, but it was all of these different people that came together who in their own self-interest were acting, and the pencil got created. So the market is in that way quite powerful. The second sort of positive that that a market-oriented system and a growth-oriented system is what's needed is because, of course, the market and the prevalence of a market and growth-oriented economy since really the Industrial Revolution has coincided with the period of great human flourishing, right? And human well-being and life expectancies have gone up, and caloric intake has gone up, and all of this was contemporaneous with capitalism. So all of that's very positive. The negative issues around capitalism and growth and our economy is that basically the historical empirics show that you can't break the relationship between material consumption and material use, emissions, and GDP. So if you run a regression between CO2 emissions and the size of the world economy, you get an R squared of around 0.97. So basically, as the economy grows, emissions grow, and as emissions grow, the economy grows. And our challenge is how do you break that relationship? Some think that technology will break it. I am more of the view that you need major lifestyle changes, especially major lifestyle changes from those of us, I'll look right at myself, those of us in the high income world and high income people in the high income world who live a life that, people couldn't even dream about 100 years ago, flying anywhere on a moment's notice, big homes, cars, et cetera, et cetera. I think I'm not going to give you an answer one way or another. I teach part-time at Columbia, so I always answer good questions with reading assignments. So I'm going to tell you to read the work of Jason Hickel, Hickel. He's a wonderful anthropologist in London who wrote a great book called Less is More. And the work of Georgios Kallis, Kallis, who's really one of the intellectual leaders of the degrowth movement. And they've really articulated this argument that we will need to decrease the size of the economy, especially in high income, high consumption people, if we are to live within planetary boundaries. And the more I sort of look at the numbers and the more I just see the inertia in the system, I think that's probably the right answer. Theoretically, I think the chances of having people change their lifestyles, though, are very low. And so technology is our best bet. But it's a great question. It's a really, really thoughtful. And hopefully, Alexander, I gave you some things to read and look at and I'm very happy to continue the discussion at any point.
Yes, thank you. I'm adding this to my book list.
Good, good.
So you mentioned that capitalism is global. It's just different shades. I think now we're ready for Nancy's question. Nancy Stratford, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, thank you, Stephanie. And thank you, Aniket. It's a pleasure to meet you over this Zoom. And thank you so much for your time. What about China's participation in the sustainability effort? I mean, I don't know how much we can know about that. What do you think we can expect? And how will that impact what we do? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. China is a complicated question for many reasons. One of them is, of course, that China is just trying to join us in the high income world. And, the per capita GDP of China is the largest or pretty close to being the largest global economy in purchasing power parity terms in aggregate. But on a per capita basis, it's around 1/4 that of the US, which is just to say that if you go to China, people are saying, we still need to catch up with you. Thank you very much. China's per capita CO2 emissions today are around 40% that of the United States. So they're at 8 tons of CO2 per capita. The US is at 18 tons of CO2 per capita. So, around 40 to 50%. So China, first point I would say is that China feels like they still have a lot of development that needs to happen, and that there are still several hundred million people at China who are not in poverty, but are in still, much lower living standards than we have here in the US. That's the first point. The second point about China is that they are, of course, big believers in the strategic value of decarbonization and being leaders in that. So it may or may not surprise you that China is the largest investor in renewable energy. It's larger than the next 3 countries put together. China is the largest electric vehicle market by a long shot. Chinese research and development institutions and scientific bodies have really highlighted the renewable transition and the sustainability transition as a major strategic sort of focus for them, because they think this will be the future of where the world is going, and it sort of will cut China away from being tied to the US dollar, because most oil and gas trade is on dollars, and also the volatility that comes from commodity markets, and they are a net importer of fossil fuels. So, they see this as a strategic issue. The challenge of all of this, of course, with China when it comes to climate, is that they are predominantly a coal economy. 70% of the Chinese economy today, or the Chinese energy system, comes from coal. And like the United States, like our issue with West Virginia, by the way, that we're seeing play itself out right in front of us right now, where Joe Biden's going to go to COP with nothing in his hands, most likely because one senator in West Virginia and sort of the economic geography. By the way, I did my PhD in economic geography, and this is a great proof point of the importance of economic geography. You have to think about economics within context, and you wouldn't understand US without West Virginia and coal. Just like that, China has its own coal regions with people whose livelihoods depend on coal. Same thing exists with India. And it's very hard for Xi Jinping to just say, we're going to shut this down, and all you people, we're just going to figure out what you do with your work going forward. I mean, that's a very hard project. So to answer your question, I am not naive about the difficulty of China's position. I'm also a believer that we should laud and applaud China for the big progress that they have made in what they can on this transition. And I think the biggest thing, and I put out a note about this just yesterday, that the one thing we should be looking for at COP26 that I think is the biggest sign of whether we change direction is what happens between US and China there, because it was the US and China partnering on Paris in 2014-15 that led to the Paris Agreement. We need the tensions between US and China to decrease and cooperation, particularly on climate, to increase. And I think we should all be hoping that happens more and more in the next few weeks, because otherwise we're not going to be in a good place. But it's a great question about China. I think we in the West don't really understand China very well. And I think myself included, we would all benefit from spending more time in there and understanding how their system is evolving.
Thanks so much, Aniket.
And by the way,
On
there's
that
a
note,
wonderful
Aniket,
scholar. There's a wonderful scholar at Brookings, at the Council on Foreign Relations, who's written a lot about this, named Elizabeth Economy is actually her last name, and you should look up her work on China and climate and sort of what we can trust and what we can't trust from China on this. And just another point about China, if I may, is that the other interesting thing about China when it comes to climate is that they are putting out into the world a different economic system than the United States, one with a much more significant role of the state. Still a capitalist system. Most of this is still, market driven. There's a lot of private ownership of the means of production, although there is significant state ownership there. I think the big sort of political science question here is that are democracies or are sort of non-democracies more capable of long-term long-term transitions like climate? Which system is better suited for the types of trade-offs and uncertainties and so on that come from a climate transition? And I think we're going to be debating that question quite a bit over the next little while.
So I think Gabriel Rainey has a perfect follow-up question regarding big oil and Gabriel. Are you still here, Gabriel? Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, I am sure. I'm also gonna have to stay with the camera off. Things are a bit messy here as well, but
we understand. We actually, I think the alum would love to have a view of one of the dorm rooms, actually. So, but no pressure.
And it's great we have students, by the way. We've opened it up this year for students and alumni. So hats off to the students. Go ahead, Gabriel.
Yeah, so this is a bit of a wordy question, what I had typed. But following up on what you had previously said, it was something to the effect of, given that this was the reply to the first question, given that the markets are structured, a market orientation is the most efficient way to allocate resources. Now, I want to sort of dig into the first part of that a little bit. So what I had said is, given that regulation determines the structure of markets and that government plays an accordingly large role in private sector emissions, to what extent is it fair to frame this as a knowledge-based problem? There has been fairly definitive research on the likely impacts of climate change available since the 80s, and it is matter of public record that companies like Exxon have waged successful disinformation campaigns to influence public opinion. One of two major American political parties reflects these sentiments, whether from ignorance or opportunism is up to interpretation. And to what extent do you believe this can be solved in the limited time frame we have, given that significant regulatory action in this environment seems unlikely?
Yeah, look, here's what I agree with you about. I think number one, the scientific world has known about climate change as a big problem for a long time. Svante Arrhenius, who was one of the first recipients of the Nobel Prize, he basically in the back of the envelope in the late 1800s was basically came to the conclusion that if you double CO2 emissions, you get between 4 and 8 degrees Celsius of climate change, which is what all these fancy computer models are telling us today. We've known for a long, long time. The government has known for a long time. You're right. Most interestingly, the oil companies knew this in the 60s and 70s. And as you rightly said, have been waging a disinformation campaign and a misinformation campaign for 40, 50 years. And today they were all hauled out in front of Congress and, criticized and so on. But we all end up still using the oil and gas that they have made us addicted to. If you ask me, so it is a knowledge-based problem insofar as it's a knowledge-based problem because we still not enough people know the real truth around it, that this is changing, but as you rightly noted, there's been a long period of misinformation. Can we solve this? I think it is solvable. It just will require an unbelievable amount of work. In other words, we can change the rules of the economy. We can change the regulation. Look at what we did with the COVID response. The US government and the ECB and the Bank of Japan, all these people just started printing almost an unlimited amount of money, backstopped entire economies to go and make sure we didn't fall off a cliff. It is possible. There's no technological challenge in terms of the technology of energy or the technology of money that prevents us. It just requires mindset shift. It requires a change in the paradigm. That is really hard. The inertia around that is very difficult. And without that change in mindset in individuals, you can't get the change in the regulation. And if you don't get the change in the rules and the regulation, you don't get the change in the market. And if you're without the change, it's all of this is connected. If you ask me, will we solve this problem? I'm not too confident about that. To be honest, I think that we have entered into sort of a pretty dark next 100 to 200 years of history. I think that we need to brace ourselves for it. I think those of us in the high income world will largely be okay, especially high income people in the high income world. Poor people in the US are already being affected more by climate change than rich people. And then entire regions of the world, Africa, South Asia, are going to reach almost an unbelievable set of pain over the next 100 years. Now, let's hope during that 100 years, we also gain our senses, have a few breakthroughs, and also have we need just a few good pieces of luck. Let's hope, for example, that the climate sensitivity to more CO2 in the air is on the lower end of the range as opposed to the higher end of the range. Maybe 1 or 2 big volcano eruptions will mean that we get a little bit of temporary cooling. I think we'll need a few of those pieces of good luck. But what I can tell you from where we sit as people, what we need to do is we need to really change the mindset. We need to change the mindset in business and in economics and in finance. I think that may be happening. We need to change it in people. We need to change it in our political leaders to say, we're going to go after this problem. There are going to be trade-offs. In the long run, we're better off. So let's do it. That only happens if more of us get involved in the fight.
Well, let me ask you just a provocative question, on this, given your rather pessimistic outlook, what makes you get up in the morning in your role, talking, first of all, thinking about these issues, and secondly, talking to investors and obviously seeing or realizing that the willingness to change that mindset that you so eloquently described is going to be an almost unsurmountable hurdle?
Yeah, it's a great question. I to be honest, I wonder that more and more these days. I think that because we're all amongst friends here, I think to answer your question, what gets me up in the morning is that I'm obsessed intellectually with these topics. I can't get enough of it. I'm so deeply fascinated. I mean, I'm even more fascinated with these topics today than I was 10 years ago. And I think it's probably my greatest gift that the world has given me, that I'm just so unbelievably interested in this that I can't stop thinking about it. I can't stop reading about it. And anybody who will listen to me, or better than that, anyone who will talk to me about their work on this, I'm all ears, because today I've been asked to talk, but I'm really usually just sitting and listening to people who are working on this or talking about their issues. So to answer your question, what gets me up in the morning is that I'm obsessed with the topic, and I can't stop thinking about it. Now, where does the energy go? I think that, there was a big part of me, again, I'm just being very honest with this crowd, for the last several years, who thought that this is a technocratic investment question. And as you know, Simon, for years I worked with Jeff Sachs and his teams and looked at macro models and looked at incremental capital, I-core models, and all this of how much capital would we need and what's the return on that capital, and how do we look at the capital needs of different sectors in different regions, and then what are the regulatory changes and what are the types of financial institutions that we need. And I really did for a long time think that this was a technocratic problem. I've become more of the view that this is not a technocratic problem anymore, but that it's a question of how we organize ourselves and how do we want to live, what type of life we all do want to live. It's the mindset issue, which is why I've spent a lot more time recently reading anthropology, reading some stuff in religion. One of my heroes was an anthropologist named David Graeber, who sadly died last year. And if you haven't heard of David Graeber, I would highly recommend learning about him. And he just came, and posthumously, he was working on a book with a archaeologist named David Wengrow. It's called The Dawn of Everything, and it's all about prehistoric societies and how in prehistoric societies, people lived very differently than they live today. And it wasn't that they were it wasn't that prehistoric society, people, 5,000-6,000 BC, it wasn't that these people were primitive, but they just had different ways of organizing. And David Graeber, one of my favorite quotes of his, he says, the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is made by man, and we could just as easily make a different world. And I think there's something very powerful about that. I've now become more of the belief that we need to change what we think of as the good life, and think about how we live and how we interact with one another. I think that's the only way we come out of this. And so, yeah, I think it's great that the investment world is interested, and any project, any green project anyone wants to finance today will be funded. The investors are willing to fund green. Look at green bond issuance, off the charts. Every green fund oversubscribed. It is amazing how much appetite there is from investors who want to now allocate, and I'm glad about it. I think that's good. But this is one of these problems where we don't have 100 years to solve it. We have 30 to 50. And so and I think the only way we speed it up is if we change what we do as people. And so, yeah, that's what sort of keeps me going. It's a obsession with the topic, and also getting to meet really nice people. Like I'm sure many of you on the stage, many of you here in the Zoom, and many of you who are asking these really fascinating questions that I'm reading in the chat.
It's almost, we're coming up to the hour, and we actually have a cascade of questions. I almost think, Aniket, we need to invite you back for part 2.
I would be delighted.
We're now getting into the philosophy of it all. In terms of coming up to the hour, what you just finished with gives us something to think about, but Somebody put in the chat, let's see, who's working, with CEOs that are trying to invest resources, and she asked about the talking points. I would like to ask you, in terms of the people here who may be interacting with folks that they need to make a case for investing with sustainability and human rights in mind, rather than sort of endowments and bottom lines. Can you provide some takeaways, some arguments, some the elevator speech, if you will, for what you think is the most persuasive argument that can be made?
Yeah, the most persuasive argument is that the world is changing. The most persuasive argument is that Tesla today is worth $1 trillion, more than all the car companies in the world put together. The persuasive argument is that customers care more about climate than ever before. Regulators care more about climate before. You have 83 central banks in the world that have joined up in something known as the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, to talk about how monetary policy can be aligned with climate change. You have a COP26 in Glasgow, which is going to bring together most of the world's leaders to talk about this problem. So every part of what drives a company's value, whether it's the economy, the monetary economy, the fiscal economy, the regulatory domain, or what customers want, or what technologies are able to do, all of this is moving us in a direction where sustainability, climate change, all of this is the value driver. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. So I don't think we need, I think frankly, if you find yourself having to still make that pitch to your CEO, I would actually say you should find another job, because your CEO is not I really believe it. I mean, they've completely missed the last 10 years, and you probably don't want to trust him or her with your future earnings. So I think now the question is not the why, but it's the how. And that's really an interesting change now. I don't ever have to give the pitch about why climate change and 2 degrees Celsius and this. You don't need to say that anymore. It's how do you get it done? How do you bring all these different pieces together and do it in a way that if you're in a business that is commercially achievable and successful? It's a wonderful question, right? It's a wonderful set of insights that lead that type of question. But I think that just so I can be useful to the person who's asking the question, it is to remind the CEO that every single part of what drives that company's value is changing. The preferences of shareholders are changing. The preferences of customers are changing. The preferences of regulators are changing. And what technology is able to do is changing. So, you better get on board and get on board quickly. Otherwise, you're going to get washed away.
So thank you, Aniket. And thank you, Simon, for bringing Aniket to us this evening.
It was great.
We are here every Thursday night, 8 o'clock. Holidays an exception.
Yeah, for sure. Next week after, come and join us. We're having a great time every Thursday. We have a great guest, just like Aniket tonight. And again, hats off to the guests and Simon. Just being up 2 a.m, you sit there, you're still going. You certainly get the final word, Simon. So you can close out the show.
Oh, wait a minute. I do remember what next Thursday is, though. And no matter what age you are, this is still relevant. In fact, you young students can get an early start, because the subject next week is aging wisely. For some of us, it's too late. The die is cast. But yes, Simon, you take us home.
Well, I think Aniket left us with a lot of food for thought. I certainly won't be able to fall asleep now. But it was absolutely fascinating, as always. The way you kind of analyzed the problem. And showed us just kind of the whole range and the gamut of of the issue. And ultimately, I think for me, the main takeaway is that, this is not primarily a technological challenge. It is really a social challenge. It is a challenge of coordination, ultimately, international coordination at the highest level. And these are the trickiest, in my opinion, the trickiest questions that, we as a human race could possibly face. So I do think it's a huge topic. There's no obvious answers. There's no obvious solutions. And we will see if, the baby steps will get us there, or if some kind of, let's say, last minute reckoning will kind of bring the solution to this.
The zombie apocalypse, Simon.
Well,
So,
yeah, perhaps.
Well, thanks, Simon. Thanks, Aniket.
thanks.
Thank you all. Such a
Have a good
pleasure.
night.
Thank you so much. Have a
See
good
you
night.
next